It was a warm, golden afternoon in the heart of the city, a perfect day for Big Shaq to unwind. Shaquille O'Neal, often referred to by his fans simply as Shaq, was not only a basketball legend, but a public figure whose height, humor, and personality made him instantly recognizable across the globe. Standing at over 2 meters tall, with a deep, booming voice and an iconic smile, Shaq's presence was nothing short of awe-inspiring. But on this particular day, he wasn't on the court or at some glamorous event. No, Big Shaq had decided to do something many people of his stature often don't have the luxury of doing. He decided to go to the corner store. It was a simple errand, something he enjoyed because it offered a break from the spotlight, a chance to enjoy a few minutes of normalcy in a world that always seemed to demand more from him. Dressed casually in a loose gray t-shirt, faded jeans, and a gleaming silver watch that glinted in the sunlight, Shaq stepped into his usual local grocery store, a small but busy market he frequented. The familiar hum of shoppers, the clinking of carts, and the gentle murmur of conversation filled the air. Shaq, ever the approachable figure, was greeted by the staff with nods and smiles. They knew him well by now, and while his height might turn a few heads, there was no fanfare, no camera flashes, just a man shopping for cereal. It was almost like the good old days, a time before fame had completely overtaken him, when he could live in the moment and enjoy the small pleasures of life. Shaq moved down the aisles, picking up items here and there, scanning for his favorite brands. He was engrossed in the task, flipping boxes and reading labels with intense concentration. But even though the store was full, it seemed he had blended into the background, a gentle giant going about his business. Little did he know, however, that this seemingly peaceful trip was about to take an unexpected turn. As Shaq moved from the cereal aisle to the snack section, he suddenly heard a sharp voice behind him. "Excuse me, young man." The voice was stern and carried a certain authority. Shaq turned around, expecting to see a store employee or another customer who might need help reaching something on a high shelf. But instead, he was met with the sight of a petite woman, probably in her early 90s, leaning heavily on a cane, her silver hair neatly done, and her shopping cart squeaking with every step. Her name was Mrs. Margaret, a regular at the store known for her no-nonsense attitude. Though frail, her eyes were sharp, and her opinions were often loud and clear. She wasn't the type to shy away from speaking her mind, especially when it came to what she perceived as a lack of decorum or propriety in the world around her. "How am I supposed to get my cereal when you're standing in the way?" she demanded, her voice cutting through the ambient noise of the store. Shaq, a man used to receiving attention wherever he went, was startled at first. He had not expected to be the subject of such a direct confrontation. Without missing a beat, he quickly stepped aside with a polite smile. "Oh, sorry about that, ma'am," he said, his voice calm and respectful. But Mrs. Margaret wasn't finished. She glanced up at him with a disapproving frown that seemed to weigh 1,000 pounds. Her eyes, sharp as ever, looked him over like she was appraising something she found lacking. "They'll let anyone in here these days," she muttered, shaking her head. "No standards anymore." Shaq blinked, his expression softening slightly. He could feel the sting of the comment, but he didn't want to escalate things. He'd heard remarks like that before, and he knew how easily things could spiral if he let his emotions take the wheel. Instead, he simply nodded and replied, "Sorry you feel that way, ma'am." But as Shaq returned to his shopping, a lingering feeling of discomfort settled in. He knew the tone of her words wasn't an isolated case. She had made her judgment based on something more than just him blocking her cereal, something deeper. But he wasn't about to let it ruin his day. Shaq, still deep in thought, moved down the aisle toward the canned goods. He had almost forgotten about the brief exchange with Mrs. Margaret when suddenly he heard her voice again. This time, however, it was much louder, ringing through the store with an urgency that made people stop in their tracks. "Security! Someone get security here now!" she shouted, her voice high-pitched and trembling with anger. People turned, confused, wondering what had happened. The security guard, a young man in his early 20s, looked over from the entrance and immediately started walking toward the aisle. His face was one of concern, unsure of what was going on. Mrs. Margaret, her finger now trembling with a mix of fury and conviction, pointed directly at Shaq. "Get him out of here! People like him don't belong here! Send him back to Africa." The words were like a slap in the face. Shaq stood frozen for a moment, taking in the full weight of her statement. He had heard his share of racial slurs and prejudiced remarks throughout his life, but something about this moment felt different. The blatant cruelty in her words hit harder than most. It was as if, despite his fame, his success, and his place in this community, he was still not seen as a person, just an outsider. The store grew quiet, save for the squeaky cart Mrs. Margaret was pushing. The security guard hesitated, looking back and forth between Mrs. Margaret and Shaq. He clearly didn't know how to proceed. "Ma'am," the security guard said, his voice low and cautious. "He hasn't done anything wrong. He's just shopping." Mrs. Margaret wasn't backing down. Her face turned beet red with frustration as she banged her cane on the floor, the sound echoing throughout the store. "Are you refusing to listen to me?" she demanded. "Get the manager." At this point, the store manager, a middle-aged man named Mark, appeared from behind the aisles, his face already serious as he surveyed the situation. Mrs. Margaret wasted no time. She pointed at Shaq once again, this time with a sense of finality. "I want him out of this store. Right now," she insisted, her voice sharp and uncompromising. The tension in the store was palpable, and all eyes were on Shaq. Everyone knew who he was, but for the first time, they saw a different side of him, one that had nothing to do with basketball, fame, or wealth. This was the man, the person, standing before them, holding his ground with unshakable poise. Shaq took a deep breath. He had faced these types of moments before, but this one felt different. His hands were steady, his posture relaxed, but his heart was heavy with the weight of Mrs. Margaret's words. The store manager looked nervously between Shaq and Mrs. Margaret, clearly uncomfortable. He opened his mouth to say something, but Shaq raised his hand slightly, signaling that he wanted to speak. "Ma'am," Shaq said, his deep voice filling the aisle, "I understand that you may not be used to seeing someone like me here, but I'm just here to shop, like you and everyone else. I'm a son, a friend, a hardworking man, and a citizen of this community. My skin color doesn't change that." For a moment, the store was silent. The only sound was the low hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. Mrs. Margaret didn't seem to know how to respond. Her gaze faltered for the first time since the exchange had started, and the anger in her eyes began to fade, replaced by a subtle confusion. Shaq's voice softened as he continued. "I've faced comments like yours before. They're hurtful, and yes, they sting. But I choose not to respond with anger. Instead, I feel sad. Sad that someone who has lived as long as you have could still hold on to such outdated views." The manager and the other customers stood frozen, caught in the raw sincerity of Shaq's words. The security guard looked uncomfortable, but was clearly relieved by Shaq's calm demeanor. Mrs. Margaret's hand trembled as she slowly lowered it, her grip on her cane tightening. Shaq continued, his words powerful yet gentle. "I have a grandmother about your age. She taught me to respect my elders. But if she were here and heard the words you said to me, I think she'd be disappointed." It was a quiet moment. A few customers in the aisle wiped their eyes, overcome with emotion at the grace Shaq was showing. For all his fame and success, here was a man who had managed to hold his dignity in the face of something so hurtful and unjust. His compassion in that moment was something that transcended race, fame, and even the hurtful words directed at him. Mrs. Margaret stood there, her frail figure now looking even smaller as she absorbed Shaq's words. Her eyes, once fiery with anger, had softened. Shaq's voice had pierced through her hardened exterior, and for the first time, it seemed as though she was truly listening. Shaq continued, his voice lowering to a near whisper. "You've seen the world change. The country, the city, the people, all of us have changed. And for the better, I believe. But if your grandchildren were here right now, and they heard what you said, what would they think of you?" Mrs. Margaret's eyes slowly fell to the floor, her face flushing with embarrassment. She wasn't expecting this. She wasn't prepared for someone to speak to her in such a way. Not in this calm, understanding tone, as though he were reaching out to the very core of her humanity, asking her to see the world from a different perspective. The room grew heavier as the weight of the moment sank in. For a few moments, there was nothing but silence. No sound except the soft shuffle of feet, the faint hum of the cooling units in the ceiling, and the faint rustle of bags as shoppers who had been watching carefully began to move closer, drawn by the emotional gravity of the situation. Shaq's words hung in the air, a challenge, a question, and a plea for change all at once. "Is this really the legacy you want to leave behind?" Shaq's voice cracked slightly with emotion, though he quickly composed himself. "Do you want to be remembered for the things that divide us? Or do you want to be remembered for the things that unite us? The world doesn't need more hate, ma'am. It needs more understanding." The transformation in Mrs. Margaret's expression was subtle at first. Her lips trembled and her shoulders sagged slightly as the last vestiges of her anger melted away. It was as if a wall had come down, brick by brick, replaced by a dawning realization of the impact of her words. I didn't think of it that way," Mrs. Margaret whispered, her voice breaking slightly. She looked up at Shaq with newfound regret in her eyes. "I'm sorry, I truly am." Shaq smiled, a gentle, understanding smile that conveyed no judgment. "It's okay, ma'am. We all make mistakes. It's what we choose to do after the mistake that matters." He took a step back, giving her space to process the interaction. Mrs. Margaret's eyes filled with tears. Her gaze dropped to the floor, and for the first time, she looked genuinely remorseful, as though she understood the weight of what had just occurred. The store manager, who had been watching the exchange in stunned silence, finally spoke. "Thank you, Mr. O'Neill, for your kindness. I can't imagine how difficult this must have been for you." Shaq nodded. "It's not about me. It's about all of us. We all have a part to play in making this world a better place. That's the real game we're all in." As the words sank in, a shift in the atmosphere became noticeable. The tension in the air was replaced with something softer, more reflective. A few customers who had been standing nearby began to applaud gently. First one, then another, and soon more joined in. The store, once thick with discomfort and confusion, was now filled with a palpable sense of understanding. Even the young security guard, who had been unsure how to handle the situation, approached Shaq, his face filled with admiration. "Thank you, man," he said quietly, extending his hand. "You handled that way better than anyone could have expected." Shaq smiled and shook his hand firmly. "It's all good, just trying to do the right thing." Mrs. Margaret, visibly shaken, approached Shaq. With trembling hands, she reached out and placed her hand on his arm. Her voice, softer now, spoke with a sincerity that wasn't there before. "Thank you for being patient with me," she said, her words barely above a whisper. "I didn't mean the things I said. I'm sorry." Shaq looked down at her, his smile warm but steady. "It's all right, ma'am. It's never too late to learn. I'm just glad we could talk about it. That's the first step." The store manager, still looking somewhat overwhelmed, took a step forward. "I think it's safe to say that this has been a turning point," he said. "Shaq, we owe you a huge thank you for how you handled this." Before Shaq could respond, the applause in the store grew louder. People had gathered around, moved by the moment they had just witnessed. There was no animosity in the air now, just admiration for the way Shaq had turned a moment of hatred into one of understanding. Shaq nodded again, his eyes scanning the room. The people here, most of whom he didn't know personally, were now united in this shared experience. He felt proud that his actions had made a difference, no matter how small. The applause, however, was not for him, but for the message he had conveyed. The message of forgiveness, compassion, and the power of speaking up in a moment of injustice. Mrs. Margaret, once a woman quick to judge and dismiss, was now a different person. The hard edge that had marked her life seemed to soften as she stood there, humbled and regretful. Shaq's words had reached her in a way nothing else could. She had spent years carrying old, outdated views, but now she was seeing the world in a new light. I'll do better," Mrs. Margaret said, her voice quiet but determined. "I will." As Shaq left the store that evening, the sun had begun to set, casting a golden light over the streets. The soft glow of the setting sun mirrored the warmth in Shaq's heart. He had come to the store that day expecting nothing more than a simple shopping trip, but he had left with something far more meaningful. Proof that kindness could break through even the toughest of barriers. Walking down the street, he felt a sense of peace. He hadn't just bought groceries that day. He had helped a woman see the error of her ways, and in doing so, had created an opportunity for growth for both her and himself. He couldn't help but think of how proud his grandmother would have been of him, and how she would have smiled at the way he had handled this moment with such grace. The story of what had transpired in the store spread quickly through the community. People were talking about it, sharing it on social media, and discussing the powerful lessons that had come from that single moment of confrontation. Mrs. Margaret, once known for her prejudices, began to show kindness to everyone she met. She became a quiet advocate for change, talking to her family, especially her grandchildren, about how she had learned the importance of respect and compassion. As for Shaq, he didn't need the praise or the recognition. He continued to lead with the same humility and strength that had defined his life. The real victory wasn't in winning applause. It was in seeing someone change, seeing a life touched by kindness, and knowing that even the smallest actions can ripple out and affect the world in profound ways. And so, Big Shaq walked on, knowing that, in a world so often divided by hatred and misunderstanding, one act of kindness had the power to heal and unite.